I want to talk to you all about something that's been on my mind recently. For a few months, one way or another, boiling around, which is the sort of sanitizing and whitewashing of America's founding fathers, as it were, and the early generations. And no, I'm not looking at, like, the slave issue, right? Baking that in, that was out in the open essentially, and we were always kind of taught about that, at least in my era. But even, I had an old American history text from like 1910 or something. No, it was after that. I don't remember when it was from, because it covered World War I, so it had to be the 1920s. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book, but even there, it recognized some of the issues that are kind of contentious right now. I'm talking about something that I feel like flew under the radar for a long, long time. And there's a couple of instances of it. The first one is the revolution itself. How, while it wasn't an incredibly bloody war and military engagements tended to be relatively small, it really pitted neighbor against neighbor in ugly sorts of ways, where communities that were either loyalist or rebel were, I don't remember where I ran into this. Oh, I know, the game era. Yeah, the word patriot seems so absolutely wrong for someone who is completely disloyal to the government they were born to. It's just, it's such a false thing, right? Absolute doublespeak right there, and propaganda, and we were always given that, oh, it's the patriots versus the loyalists. No, it's the rebels versus the loyalists. It was a revolution, I mean, we got to get into that at some point. The difference between revolution and civil war, which frankly to me seems to come down to who won more than anything else, rather than anything significant there. But anyway, we'll see if I can figure out something to say about that beyond that. But yeah, the revolution was an incredibly volatile breakup that, really turned neighbor against neighbor. They talk about the Civil War doing that. The reality in the Civil War was largely regional. The United States were each kind of individually had a certain philosophy to them. And while you had a set of states in the South and a set of states in the North that were kind of diametrically opposed on one issue, the slavery issue, not the states' rights issue, because both sides would play that for their own tastes, right? So, like, you could argue a states' rights argument that made Dred Scott not work. You could make there was a states' rights, in fact, a secession threat around tariffs, because the northeastern states wanted more protection for their goods. And tariffs were absolutely anathema to the agricultural South and West. So there was a movement to go for a full separation. Honestly, my feeling is that any club that forces, or any grouping that forces you to stay within it, is inherently tyrannical. But anyway. there was just this, you know, horrendous harrying of anyone who had sympathies that went in the wrong direction and whatnot, and that didn't tend to be as regional. Um, I'm sure there were regional distinctions, just as there were, say, in the Salem witch trials or whatever. But it's often just kind of glossed over. There's the, yeah, people were tarred and feathered, and some were lynched or whatever. But the degree to which there was intercolonial violence on this issue is really kind of whitewashed over to a large degree. Now, when you get to like the era where they're writing the Constitution after the Confederation fell apart, you kind of have to remember these are men, right? They're not exalted figures of gods or whatever. They're men that had their own personal interests involved in this. Maybe more importantly, their regional interests that, you know, they couldn't really go against without alienating the people who sent them to the convention. And while they had an idea and a fair amount of knowledge about things that like tore apart the Roman Republic and tried to protect against that, and maybe a little less so about things that like damaged the Athenian democracy. And they had many worries based on their class. They were almost all wealthy, landowning people who gathered together to make these rules. So they had great worries about the mob. They put something together, and the fact that it's lasted and kind of worked for a long period of time gives it this sort of level of oh, this is so important, puts their words and thoughts onto a pedestal, which honestly I don't think it really belongs to be on. And here's the thing. When I was, 12 or 13 until maybe 14 or 15, maybe not, maybe 8 or 9 until 14 or 15, I don't know. I had the kind of reverence, not any thought that, that they were coming up with the ultimate answers or whatever, but that we had gone wrong at certain points. And obviously one of them, as I've already expressed, was trying to force states not to secede. But there were others. The direct election of senators, while that was done through the amendment process, I feel like that was a shift away from the founders in a dangerous sort of fashion. You no longer had senators being appointed by the state legislatures, which there was a layer of indirection in there, just like the Electoral College originally was a layer of indirection. And now it's just sort of this anachronism. It doesn't do what it was supposed to do, but it is still there to create, kind of unreasonable proportions where certain states have way too much political power in the electing of the president. And similarly, these states also have an inordinate amount of power in terms of dealing with laws. But that made sense at the time. There was definitely this worry of small and large states, and we still have that kind of issue. If you went, to a more still representative democracy, but if you went to some kind of proportioning of senators that was and representatives even, because like states like Wyoming with only one representative, we haven't extended the House to be large enough to make that even make sense, which I feel is actually more problematic. When they capped the size of the House of Representatives and ensured that each state gets at least one vote in it, I feel like that broke one of the tenets. I do believe very strongly that the Senate should be made up the way it is. As anti-democratic as it is, each state was conceived of as a very powerful, singular, almost autonomous entity. And that broke with the Civil War, where we stopped being these United States and became the United States, essentially. We became a singular country as opposed to a federation in the way where each state had its own rights, etc. Now, the original 13 colonies made a lot of sense to be coming into it and saying, hey, it shouldn't be necessarily, just by population. Delaware, as one example, Rhode Island, some of these really had serious worries that they might be simply overwhelmed by interests of larger states. Now, at this point, larger states don't really matter. Now, the tiny ones really do, because they tend to fit a certain geographical pattern that, lots of territory, not a lot of people in it. And there I'm thinking primarily states in the Rocky Mountains for the most part, as being the most extreme versions of that. Alaska too, I guess. But anyway, these compromises that were made were based on the particular worries of, the 1790s, well, 1780s, late 1780s, essentially, and there's peculiarities in them about that. Now, you can make the same kind of argument with gun laws, but I would be perfectly fine with sort of the original interpretation of how the Second Amendment was dealt with in the early years. What we've done is gone into some sort of textual variant where the Second Amendment could be read multiple ways, and they've just chosen one very, very specific and especially loose one that honestly it's hard to understand how, this current Supreme Court would stand up against, like, the laws that prohibited automatic weaponry, or that would prohibit you from owning your own artillery pieces, right? Anyway, because their principles don't seem to accept anything. There's something very weird about the First Amendment. It's the only one that I think is worded, Congress shall enact no laws, which almost implies that you could violate the First Amendment at the state or local level without any problem. All the others seem to be broader. It seems very specific, and I think we're going to see a fight on that, because that wording is very, very much against free speech, except insofar as Congress limits it. Now, given that federal power derives from Congress, I don't think that I don't think there's going to be a good answer for those who are in favor of like federal attacks on free speech for whatever reason, or you know whatever they're trying to do right now. But I think a good argument could be made that states, at the very least, have the right to violate your free speech right. But then the other thing beyond the revolution, the constitutional stuff was just sort of a side trip. Beyond the Constitution was how corrupt the US government was early on. In terms of like, right now there's complaints on the left mainly about government overreach and whatnot. And there were complaints about government overreach before, but on top of government overreach, just removing civil servants and whatnot, putting partisans in place and everything. That was what it was all about for the first few decades. I don't know at what point that sort of became less an issue. But there's kind of an interesting point to that, which is that I'm trying to think how to put this. That at the time, those federal agencies, etc., didn't have a whole hell of a lot of power. It was mainly used as a reward, right? You ended up doing work for a given political party. Your party comes into power. You now have a job, and the people who had it before are gone. And that clearly wasn't sustainable, right? You wanted a competent bureaucracy as the government grew in power. Now, obviously, the more, I guess, conservative, but it's hard to really call it conservative because for so long we've been a government of big bureaucracy. But the argument of those who call themselves conservative is that we should cut back government, we should make it smaller, because there's too much capability for misuse, and now we're seeing that misuse being demonstrated. Right? Basically, on many levels, it feels like, and I don't think this is Trump himself. I think it's the people he's found to surround himself with, because honestly, he's not ideological about this kind of stuff, but he's latched onto it in a lot of ways, and can see that he can gain power through it. But in a lot of ways, that conservative motion, they're trying to prove all the things that they warned about in a lot of ways, like shoving partisans in, overusing the government bureaucracy to attack various things, even to the point of stuff that's just blatantly unconstitutional, like deploying federal troops for police action and such. But outside of that, a lot of it was trying to prove the point that yes, you can't trust a big government. Now, a lot of the traditions we had, this includes the whole idea of like, a professional and nonpartisan, supposedly. You can never be completely nonpartisan. That's problematic in and of itself. People who end up with government jobs are going to favor certain things just inherently, right? Like a larger bureaucracy. But the idea of this sort of professional bureaucracy based on competence and civil servants and rather than simply being patronage jobs is one which seems almost necessary in the modern world, and this is part of one of the issues. So, like I said, I had when I was between say 8 and 13 or whatever, I had this view of we went wrong in these ways. We violated in a lot of ways the growth of the bureaucracy, some of the stuff that the government took on. Some of the acts it was taking were just clearly not what the founders at all envisioned, and seemed almost anathema to them, to what they put forward. But like the change, between the Bronze Age and today, which is why the guidance for how to live well in the Bronze Age, as handed to us, through the biblical sources, is in many ways no longer sufficient and doesn't cover everything that you need to think about and discuss. Similarly, what the founders came up with wasn't sufficient. And what we saw was a reaction to what the world is like. Okay? You have a president since World War II who has had, well, maybe a little later, who's had the capacity to unleash a nuclear Armageddon. Okay? And certainly since the Cold War kind of really ramped up, where there was no concept of anything like that, right? The president didn't need to be able to mobilize forces or to use military power anywhere except with, the agreement of Congress, usually with a declaration of war. But in the post-World War II period, we stopped declaring war. We just started intervening places. In fact, a declaration of war became an unwanted thing, which feels weird to me. I'm not sure that I like that fact, but certainly some capacity to react militarily, especially once we took on, this sort of world policeman type position, and we became one of two superpowers and then the monopower, and now back, I guess, to one of two. You really couldn't use those old mechanisms any longer. They didn't work any longer. And in the same sort of way, other aspects, as the federal, as the federal government itself grew, but perhaps more importantly, as entities, corporations, for the most part, grew to power that was greater than sort of the local political systems could handle. It became more and more important to be able to deal with that. Now, there are basically a couple of different ways this could be handled, right? I think we went down the wrong route, which was we allowed the growth of huge corporations that controlled too much, and then grew the government to try to rein them in. Whereas what really should have happened was they should have simply been busted up as soon as they got too powerful. But we may not have gotten to, what we see as this more technological and advanced, well, what is a more technological and advanced, and we see as advanced society. We might have fallen by the wayside without those huge corporations, without, although honestly, innovation seems to do better when you break up monopolies, whereas everything seems to favor, everything except government intervention seems to favor consolidation and of power, of wealth, etc., into the hands of a very few corporations. Certainly in certain realms, etc., where they get almost monopolistic power. And there's something very, very wrong with that. But there simply isn't the will politically to deal with that. And often, the few times that there has been some sort of will, say with the campaign contributions laws or whatever, where Congress could get off its ass enough to actually throw off some of the shackles of how much they're controlled and owned by corporate America. It's been reversed by the Supreme Court. And I feel like there was never the, okay, look, if we can't do it this way, let's play hardball, right? Very few people are willing to take that step and really try to break up this consolidation of power. It kind of felt like, well, if we can't even limit how much they can buy us for, then I guess the game's just lost, as opposed to taking something more severe. But yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is that the world has changed so much in the last couple hundred years that I wouldn't say that everything is pointless in the Constitution. But, and it is certainly insufficient as initially written to cope with everything. And our answer to that was the growth of these bureaucracies and granting them more and more power to make their own rules. And now we've got a court that, again, hails back to what I thought, at maybe 10 years old, which is, oh, hey, you can't really do that. You shouldn't be able to do that. That's not what the way things were written and initially intended. So stuff like Chevron is gone. Even when Congress more or less says you have the power to regulate this, if now they don't have the power to make the regulations, right? Like, the bureaucracy doesn't have the power to make the regulations. And clearly that's what was intended by Congress. Not that Congress should step in and make every regulation on their own. Now, I understand that there's, opposition to these big bureaucratic government institutions. But they are the only thing that had any power to stand up to what we otherwise allowed to happen without properly, limiting the size of corporate power. But yeah, I mean, my main point had to do with, we were taught sort of a history that doesn't delve too deeply into the kind of personal violence that existed in the Revolutionary era that I feel like we're beginning to see now more of. Although again, it is, so it's regional, but not as much by state, but more by your actual local community more than anything else. And sure, there's, people who lean in both ways, but I think that's actually very close to what you're talking about in the revolutionary period. And that's the kind of violence that I think we're heading towards in a way that I don't feel like the violence, say, of the '60s is the same kind of nature. Um, and then we're now seeing a dismantling of the anti-partisan bent to the bureaucracy in a way that harkens back to those founders once again. Now, I think, again, I had these views when I was very young, right? Kind of like, maybe I kind of liked Ayn Rand when I was, in my later teens. But a certain amount of wisdom has come across where I see, yeah, your ideals were nice, but you know what? You were just being bound by them rather than the kind of flexibility that you need to be able to react to a changing world. And why does this all come to a head? Well, because I read A Distant Mirror. And what you have there is something very similar. The ideals of chivalry, etc., which had lasted for hundreds of years, well, for a couple hundred years, and were really kind of blossoming into their fullest, just like some of this reverential treatment of early America is. On one side, against the effective ability to actually react to the changing world, which you saw in terms of battle at Poitiers and Crécy, where the English were able to change to a more effective type of military, at least for single battles, and where, who was it, Jean V of France was able to be more effective by being reactive rather than following the old order that everyone revered, and actually maneuver politically in response to the changing times. And I think that's a really important thing, that you can't just look back and say this worked then, therefore that's how we should do it. And that goes for both sides, of any argument, right? Because on the liberal side, we're looking back and saying, well, this is, the government that made America great was this growing bureaucracy, et cetera. But there have always been warning voices about it. And the ad hoc nature of that growing bureaucracy may actually be a huge part of the problem. Because instead of dealing with the root causes, we tried to blunt them with a counterweight to the corporate power that was there. And I really think that we're, at a point where things are going to really break one way or another so significantly from what all of us are used to, I mean, there ain't many people alive now who were adults in the Gilded Age. Yeah, and I think such a difference is going to be a very chaotic and very volatile and, yeah, very violent period, because that kind of change doesn't happen without it. Um, so, you know, I kind of got my wish. I get to live in interesting times, at least for a little while. Cheers.